On a bright Monday morning in Boston, Dr. Marcus Thompson walked through the sliding glass doors of Boston General Hospital, his crisp white coat perfectly pressed and his hospital ID badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. At just 32 years old, he was already making waves in the medical community as one of the most promising neurosurgeons on the East Coast. The early morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as Marcus made his way to his office on the fourth floor. People who passed him in the hallways couldn't help but notice his tall, confident presence. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his shoulders straight and his head held high. Some of the hospital staff smiled and waved. These were the ones who had worked with him and knew his incredible skill in the operating room. Others, particularly new patients or visiting doctors, often did a double take when they saw him, their eyes lingering a bit too long on his dark skin before sliding down to read the Department of Neurosurgery printed beneath his name. Marcus had grown used to these looks over the years. They started back in medical school at Harvard, where he had been one of only 3 black students in his class of 165. Even there, some classmates had whispered that he only got in because of affirmative action. Those whispers died down quickly when Marcus consistently scored at the top of every exam, but he never forgot them. As he unlocked his office door, Marcus smiled at the collection of family photos on his desk. There was one of his parents at his medical school graduation, his father, a high school history teacher, beaming with pride, and his mother, who had worked 2 jobs as a nurse to help put him through college, wiping happy tears from her eyes. Next to it stood a photo of his younger sister graduating from law school last year. The Thompsons were a family that believed in education, hard work, and never letting anyone define your limits. Marcus settled into his chair and opened his laptop to review the day's cases. He had 3 surgeries scheduled, 2 tumor removals and 1 spinal reconstruction. As he studied the patient files, his mind was already mapping out each precise cut, each careful movement that would be needed. This was where he felt most alive, most himself, in the detailed planning that would help save lives. A knock on his door interrupted his concentration. "Dr. Thompson?" It was Sarah, one of the new surgical residents. "Your first patient is here for pre-op consultation." Marcus nodded and stood up, straightening his tie. As he walked to the consultation room, he could hear voices inside. "Are you sure he's qualified?" a woman was asking. "He looks so young, and well." She didn't finish her sentence, but Marcus knew what usually came after that well. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door with a warm, professional smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," he said, extending his hand to the middle-aged woman sitting nervously with her husband. "I'm Dr. Thompson, and I'll be performing your surgery tomorrow." You could see the surprise in their eyes, the quick glance between husband and wife. But Marcus had learned long ago that the best response to prejudice was excellence. For the next 20 minutes, he walked them through the entire procedure, explaining each step in clear, simple terms, answering their questions with patience and expertise. He showed them his success rates, the highest in the department, and shared stories of similar cases he had handled. By the end of the consultation, Mrs. Chen was holding his hand, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Thompson," she said. "I feel so much better knowing I'm in your care." As Marcus walked back to his office, he thought about how far he had come from the small apartment in South Boston where he grew up. He remembered doing his homework by candlelight during the months when money was tight, and his mother's constant refrain, "Education is the one thing they can never take from you." He paused at his office window, looking out at the Boston skyline. His position at Boston General wasn't just a personal achievement. It was a statement. Every successful surgery, every life saved, every patient who learned to look past their initial prejudices was another crack in the wall of discrimination that had held back so many for so long. Marcus smiled as his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Proud of you, baby. Show them what you can do." He texted back a quick "love you, Mom," before turning to prepare for his first surgery of the day. After all, he had lives to save, and that was the most powerful statement he could make. The large conference room on the 6th floor of Boston General Hospital buzzed with excitement. It was the annual board meeting where doctors presented their latest research, and Marcus Thompson had been preparing for this moment for months. His innovative approach to treating deep brain tumors had shown incredible results, with a success rate that topped every published study in the field. Marcus stood at the front of the room, his presentation ready on the large screen behind him. He wore his best Navy suit and the lucky tie his sister had given him for his first day as an attending surgeon. Around the long mahogany table sat 20 of the hospital's most senior staff, including Dr. Richard Warner, a head administrator, a man in his 60s with gray hair and cold blue eyes who had been running the hospital for longer than Marcus had been alive. "Thank you all for being here today," Marcus began, his voice clear and confident. "Over the past year, we developed a new surgical technique that has helped us reach tumors previously considered inoperable." He clicked to the first slide, showing the impressive survival rates from his trials. He had barely finished explaining the first set of data when Dr. Warner cleared his throat loudly. "Dr. Thompson," he interrupted, his voice carrying a tone that Marcus had heard too many times before, "these numbers seem optimistic. Are you sure you've analyzed them correctly?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his heart beat faster. "Yes, Dr. Warner. We've had 3 independent teams verify the data. If you look at the next slide." "Perhaps." Dr. Warner cut in again. "This would be better suited for the general surgery department. Neurosurgery requires a certain precision." His emphasis on the word precision made several other doctors shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus took a slow, steady breath, just like his father had taught him. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, waiting to see how he would react. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few seemed to be hiding small smiles behind their hands. "Dr. Warner," Marcus replied calmly, "these techniques have already saved 17 lives in cases where traditional methods gave 0 chance of survival. Perhaps I could show you the detailed surgical footage." But Dr. Warner wasn't finished. He leaned back in his leather chair, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "You know, Thompson, sometimes people can get pushed ahead too quickly, placed in positions they're not quite ready for. Maybe you'd be more comfortable in a less demanding department." The room fell silent. Everyone knew exactly what Dr. Warner was implying, and it had nothing to do with Marcus's skills as a surgeon. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the younger board members, looked like she wanted to say something but remained quiet. Marcus felt a familiar heat rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd had in medical school when a professor suggested he might prefer sports medicine over neurosurgery, or when patients assumed he was an orderly despite his white coat and ID badge. But years of experience had taught him how to channel that heat into something more powerful than anger. Standing straight, Marcus clicked to his next slide. "Let me show you the case of Jenny Martinez," he said, his voice steady and professional. "She was 8 years old, with a tumor other surgeons had declared inoperable. Today, she's back in school, playing soccer, and looking forward to her 9th birthday next month." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus presented case after case, each one backed by solid data, clear surgical footage, and undeniable results. He answered every interruption with facts, met every dismissive comment with evidence, and responded to every subtle jab with professionalism. By the end of his presentation, even Dr. Warner had run out of ways to dismiss the success of Marcus's work. Other board members were leaning forward, asking interested questions about his techniques and requesting to observe his next surgery. As Marcus packed up his materials after the meeting, Dr. Chen approached him. "That was brilliant," she said quietly. "Both the research and how you handled everything." Dr. Warner was completely out of line. Marcus gave her a small smile. "Thank you," he said. "But this isn't about Dr. Warner. It's about the patients who need this treatment." Walking back to his office, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. "Remember, son, success is the best revenge, but dignity is the best armor." Marcus smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He had 3 surgeries scheduled for tomorrow, and that's what really mattered. Let them doubt him, you would keep saving lives, one operation at a time. The sun had long since set over Boston when Marcus finally sat alone in his office. The hospital corridors outside had grown quiet, with only the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes passing by. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his lucky tie, and looked at the wall of achievements before him, his Harvard Medical School diploma, his residency completion certificate, and numerous awards for surgical excellence. In the dim light of his desk lamp, Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the video he'd secretly recorded during the board meeting. He watched again as Dr. Warner dismissed his work, suggesting he move to a less demanding department. The words stung just as much the second time around. His eyes drifted to the small photo frame on his desk. It showed his father, James Thompson, standing proud in front of the high school where he taught history for 30 years. Marcus could almost hear his father's deep voice sharing stories about civil rights leaders who had faced much worse and still persevered. Next to that photo sat another, his mother in her nurse's uniform, taken on her last day of work before retirement. She had worked double shifts for years to help put him through medical school. Marcus pulled open his bottom desk drawer and took out an old, worn journal. It was filled with notes from his residency days, detailed drawings of surgical procedures, observations about patient care, and in the margins, small reminders to himself. Work twice as hard. Stay focused. Remember why you're here. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister Lisa. How did the board meeting go? Marcus started typing several responses but deleted them all. How could he explain that even after all his achievements, some people still saw his skin color before they saw his surgical skills? The sound of the cleaning staff's vacuum in the hallway brought him back to the present moment. Marcus walked to his office window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. Somewhere out there was Jenny Martinez, the 8-year-old whose inoperable tumor he had successfully removed. She was probably doing her homework or playing with her friends, living a normal life because he hadn't let anyone tell them what was impossible. He thought about his father's words from years ago, spoken after Marcus came home from middle school angry about a teacher who had suggested he focus on basketball instead of science club. Son, his father had said, there will always be people who try to put limits on your dreams. Your power lies not in proving them wrong, but in proving yourself right. Marcus's mother had her own wisdom to share. During his residency, when an attending physician had consistently given him harder assignments than his white colleagues, she told him, "Baby, pressure either breaks pipes or makes diamonds. You choose which one you'll be." Walking back to his desk, Marcus noticed his hands, surgeon's hands, steady enough to navigate the delicate pathways of the human brain. These same hands had once trembled with anger during medical school when a patient had refused to let him assist in their care. Now they remained steady even in the face of blatant prejudice. He opened his laptop and began typing. If Dr. Warner wanted to question his abilities, then Marcus would document every success, every breakthrough, every life saved. He started creating a detailed presentation of all his cases from the past year, not just the survival rates, but the quality of life improvements, the reduced recovery times, the innovations in surgical techniques. As he worked, Marcus remembered something else his father often said: true power isn't in shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest. It's in standing your ground with dignity and letting your actions speak louder than any words. The clock on his wall showed it was nearly midnight when Marcus finally finished his initial draft. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more surgeries, more patients, and yes, probably more prejudice. But he was Dr. Marcus Thompson, Harvard-educated neurosurgeon with the highest success rate in his department. He had earned his place here, and no one could take that away from him. Before leaving his office, Marcus looked one last time at his parents' photos. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. They can doubt you, they can fear you, they can even hate you, but they cannot stop you unless you let them. He switched off his desk lamp and gathered his things. Tomorrow would be another day of proving himself, of working twice as hard for half the recognition. But tonight, in the quiet of his office, Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And no amount of prejudice could change that truth. The next morning, Marcus arrived at Boston General Hospital earlier than usual. The sky was still dark, and the parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars belonging to the night shift staff. As he walked through the quiet hallways, his footsteps echoing against the tile floors, he had already made up his mind about what he needed to do. Instead of going straight to his office, Marcus headed to the hospital's small library. He found what he was looking for in the newest medical journals, studies about brain tumor treatments from around the world. Some of these papers mentioned techniques similar to his, but none had achieved his success rates. While reading, he noticed a young medical student, David Chen, struggling with a thick neurology textbook in the corner. The boy looked frustrated, his forehead wrinkled in concentration. Marcus remembered being in that same spot years ago, feeling overwhelmed and alone. "Need some help?" Marcus asked, walking over to David's table. The student looked up, surprised to see one of the hospital's top surgeons talking to him. "Dr. Thompson, aye, Yes, please. I'm having trouble understanding these brain stem pathways. For the next 30 minutes, Marcus sat with David, explaining complex concepts in simple terms, drawing diagrams on scratch paper to make things clearer. As they talked, more medical students began gathering around their table, drawn by Marcus's clear explanations and patient teaching style. That's when Marcus had his second realization of the day. While he couldn't change Dr. Warner's prejudiced mind directly, he could create something bigger than himself, a support system for young medical students, especially those from minority backgrounds who faced the same challenges he had overcome. Later that morning, Marcus met with Dr. Sarah Chen, who had supported him during the board meeting. "I want to start a mentorship program," he told her. "Something formal, with regular meetings and real guidance for students who might need extra support." Dr. Chen's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what this hospital needs," she said. "But won't this take time away from your research, especially after yesterday's meeting?" Marcus smiled. "Sometimes the best way to answer doubts is to create opportunity for others. I'm thinking bigger than just proving myself right. I want to make it easier for the next generation." Over the next few weeks, Marcus's days became even busier. He would arrive early to review cases and plan surgeries, perform his operations with his usual excellence, and then spend late afternoons mentoring students. He started a weekly study group where young doctors could discuss challenging cases and learn advanced techniques. Word spread quickly about Marcus's mentorship program. Students from other departments began showing up to his sessions. Even some senior doctors started attending, impressed by his teaching abilities and deep knowledge. One evening, as Marcus was explaining a particularly complex surgical technique to a group of residents, he noticed Dr. Warner standing in the doorway, watching. Instead of feeling nervous, Marcus continued his lesson with confidence. He knew he was doing something important, something that went beyond just proving his own worth. The residents asked thoughtful questions, eager to learn from his experience. Among them was a young black woman named Sarah Johnson, who reminded Marcus of himself 10 years ago. She had the same hunger for knowledge in her eyes, the same determination to succeed despite the obstacles. "Dr. Thompson," Sarah asked after the session, "how you deal with people who doubt you because of, you know?" Marcus thought carefully before answering. "Focus on excellence," he said. "Not to prove them wrong, but to prove yourself right. And when you make it, remember to hold the door open for others coming after you." That night, as Marcus packed up his things, he found a note on his desk. It was from David Chen, the student he'd helped in the library. "Thank you for showing us what's possible. You're changing more lives than just your patients." Marcus pinned the note next to his diplomas. His father had always said that true power isn't just in individual success, it's in lifting others up along the way. Now, Marcus was doing exactly that. Every surgery he performed saved a life, but every student he mentored could go on to save thousands more. As he drove home that evening, Marcus felt a different kind of satisfaction. He was no longer just fighting against prejudice, he was building something positive in its place. The best response to those who wanted to limit him wasn't anger or resentment, but creating opportunities that would outlast any individual's bias. One rainy Tuesday morning, Marcus's office phone rang just as he was reviewing his daily surgery schedule. It was Dr. Chen, and her voice carried an urgency he rarely heard. "Marcus, we need you in the emergency conference room. Now." 10 minutes later, Marcus sat at the conference table with the hospital's top surgeons. On the screen was an MRI scan of what looked like one of the most complex brain tumors he had ever seen. The patient was Emily Parker, a 12-year-old girl who loved ballet and had been experiencing severe headaches for the past month. "3 hospitals have already refused to operate," Dr. Chen explained, pointing to the tumor's location. "They say it's too risky, too close to critical areas. Parents brought her here as a last hope." Marcus studied the scans carefully. The tumor was wrapped around vital blood vessels like a spider in its web. One wrong move during surgery could cause permanent damage or worse. But as he looked at the images, his mind was already mapping possible approaches, seeing paths others might have missed. "I think," Marcus began, but Dr. Warner cut him off. "We should transfer her to Mayo Clinic," Dr. Warner announced, not even looking at Marcus. "This case needs someone with extensive experience." The same dismissive tone from the board meeting was back, but this time, a young girl's life hung in the balance. Marcus felt everyone's eyes on him. He stood up slowly, walked to the screen, and began to explain. "Look here," he said, pointing to a small space between the tumor and a major blood vessel. "And here. If we approach it from this angle, using the modified technique I've developed." He drew on the board, explaining each step of his proposed surgery with clear, precise details. Other doctors leaned forward, following his logic. Even Dr. Warner fell silent as Marcus outlined how he could potentially save Emily's life. "But it's never been done quite this way before," one of the older surgeons said. "That's exactly why it might work," Marcus replied. "Sometimes we need new approaches to solve problems others think are impossible." Dr. Warner cleared his throat. "Dr. Thompson, this is a high-profile case. The risk of failure is less than the certainty of what will happen if we do nothing," Marcus finished firmly. He pulled up his surgical success rates on the screen, the highest in the department. "I can do this. More importantly, Emily needs this." Just then, there was a knock at the door. It was Sarah Johnson, the resident Marcus had been mentoring. "Dr. Thompson," she said, "Emily's parents are here. They're asking to speak with the surgical team." Marcus walked into the waiting room, where he found Mr. and Mrs. Parker sitting anxiously. Their faces showed the wear of parents who had spent weeks going from hospital to hospital, hearing impossible again and again. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," Marcus said, sitting down across from them, "I'm Dr. Thompson, and I'd like to talk to you about Emily's case." He saw the familiar flicker of uncertainty in their eyes when they looked at him, but he was used to this. Instead of getting defensive, he pulled out his tablet and began showing them his surgical plans, explaining everything in simple terms they could understand. "Other doctors say it's too risky," Mrs. Parker said, her voice trembling. "There are always risks," Marcus admitted honestly. "But I've developed a new technique that I believe can help Emily. I've successfully removed tumors that others thought were impossible to reach." Mr. Parker leaned forward. "Why are you willing to try when others won't?" Marcus thought about his own journey, about all the times people had doubted him, about how proving them wrong had made him a better surgeon. Because sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from being willing to try what others think is impossible. The parents looked at each other, then back at Marcus. "When can you operate?" Mr. Parker asked. As Marcus walked back to the conference room, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. This surgery would be more than just saving one life. It would be a statement about believing in possibility when others saw only limitations. "The parents have agreed to the surgery," he announced to the waiting doctors. "I'd like to schedule it for tomorrow morning." He looked directly at Dr. Warner as he added, "Unless there are any objections." The room was silent. Sometimes, excellence speaks louder than prejudice ever could. The morning of Emily's surgery arrived with a pale winter sun barely peeking through Boston's cloudy sky. Marcus had been up since 4 a.m., reviewing the surgical plan one final time. He sat in the hospital's quiet chapel, something he did before every major surgery, gathering his thoughts and focusing his mind. At 6:30 a.m., he walked into the surgical preparation room. His team was already there. Dr. Sarah Chen as his assistant surgeon, Sarah Johnson as the resident observer, and the most experienced operating room nurses in the hospital. Everyone knew this would be a landmark surgery. Marcus noticed Dr. Warner watching from the observation deck above the operating room, along with several other senior doctors. The pressure was immense, but Marcus's hands were steady as he scrubbed in, the familiar ritual of washing up to his elbows bringing a sense of calm. Before entering the operating room, Marcus stopped to speak with Emily's parents one last time. They sat anxiously in the waiting area, holding hands. "We're ready to begin," he told them gently. "The surgery will take about 8 hours. I promise you, I'll treat Emily as if she were my own daughter." Mrs. Parker wiped tears from her eyes. "Thank you for being willing to try, Dr. Thompson." Inside the operating room, Emily lay peacefully under anesthesia, her small form almost lost among the surgical drapes. Marcus looked at his team. "Let's save this young lady's life," he said simply, and everyone moved into position. The first incision was made at exactly 7:30 a.m. The room fell into a focused silence, broken only by the steady beep of monitors and Marcus's calm requests for instruments. Through his surgical microscope, he began the delicate work of creating a path to the tumor. 3 hours in, they reached the first critical point. The tumor had wrapped itself around a major blood vessel like a snake. One wrong move could cause catastrophic bleeding. Marcus felt sweat under his surgical gown, but his hands remained perfectly steady. "Suction," he said quietly, and Sarah Chen responded immediately. Years of training and experience guided every movement as Marcus began the painstaking process of separating tumor from healthy tissue, millimeter by millimeter. In the observation deck, more doctors had gathered to watch. This was the technique Marcus had developed, the one some had dismissed as too risky. Now they watched in silence as he demonstrated its effectiveness. 5 hours into the surgery, they hit an unexpected challenge. The tumor had grown deeper than the MRI had shown. Marcus paused for a moment, analyzing the situation. He could hear his father's voice in his head. "When the path gets harder, you just have to get smarter." "I'm going to modify the approach slightly," he announced to his team. "Sarah, can you see what I'm planning?" Dr. Chen nodded, understanding immediately. This was why they worked so well together. She never doubted his judgment, only his results mattered. 7 hours in, Marcus began the final and most delicate part of the removal. The operating room was completely silent except for the vital signs monitor's steady beeping. Even Dr. Warner leaned forward in the observation deck, watching intently. "Almost there," Marcus murmured, his focus absolute. With precise movements, he carefully separated the last portions of the tumor. "Specimen basin," he called softly, and a nurse stepped forward to receive the removed tumor. Finally, after 8.5 hours of intense concentration, Marcus took a step back. "Let's close," he said quietly. He looked up at the observation deck, making brief eye contact with Dr. Warner, before turning his attention back to completing the surgery. As the team began closing, Sarah Johnson spoke up from her observation position. "Dr. Thompson, that was incredible." Marcus smiled behind his surgical mask. "That's why we never give up on a patient, no matter what others say is impossible." After scrubbing out, Marcus walked to the waiting room where Emily's parents had spent the longest 8 hours of their lives. When they saw him approaching, they stood up, faces anxious. The surgery was successful, Marcus told them. "We removed the entire tumor. Emily is in recovery now." Mrs. Parker burst into tears, hugging her husband. Mr. Parker reached out to shake Marcus's hand, then pulled him into a hug instead. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for believing it was possible." As Marcus walked back to his office later, his surgical cap still on, nurses and doctors stopped to congratulate him. But his mind was already on Emily's recovery, planning the next steps to ensure she could return to her beloved ballet. He passed by the hospital's main bulletin board where someone had posted his success rates next to the national averages. The numbers spoke for themselves. Excellence didn't need defending when it could be proven. 2 weeks after Emily's surgery, Boston General Hospital's main conference room was packed. Medical professionals from across the country had come to hear about the groundbreaking operation that had saved a 12-year-old ballet dancer's life. But before the presentation could begin, something unexpected. Marcus was doing his morning rounds when he heard music coming from room 412. He opened the door to find Emily standing carefully beside her bed, her mother holding her hand as she attempted a small ballet move. When she saw Marcus, her face lit up with a bright smile. "Dr. Thompson, look what I can do," she said excitedly, demonstrating a simple dance position. Her mother quickly made her sit back down, but the message was clear. Emily was recovering faster than anyone had expected. "Just take it slow," Marcus advised, though he couldn't help smiling. "You'll be back in your ballet shoes soon enough." Later that morning, Marcus stood at the podium in the conference room. The audience included neurosurgeons from major hospitals, medical journal editors, and yes, Dr. Warner, sitting in the front row with an unreadable expression. "Today, I want to share with you a new surgical technique," Marcus began, his voice confident and clear. "But first, I want you to meet someone." The door opened, and Emily walked in slowly, holding her father's arm. She was still weak but determined to be there. The room burst into applause as she took a seat near the front. Marcus began his presentation, explaining the innovative approach he had developed. He showed detailed surgical footage, walking through each critical decision, each careful movement that had made the impossible possible. The room was silent, completely focused on his words. During the question and answer session, a neurosurgeon from Johns Hopkins stood up. Dr. Thompson, this technique could revolutionize how we approach similar cases. How did you develop it? Marcus thought about all the late nights spent studying, all the cases others had deemed hopeless, all the times he had to prove himself. Sometimes, Dee answered, being told something is impossible makes you look harder for ways to make it possible. After the presentation, several hospital directors approached him about sharing his technique with their surgical teams. Medical journal editors wanted to feature his work in their next issues, but the most surprising moment came when Dr. Warner walked up to the podium. The older doctor stood there for a moment, looking uncomfortable. "Dr. Thompson," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. Your work. It's exceptional. I was wrong to doubt your abilities." Marcus nodded, accepting the apology with grace. "Thank you, Dr. Warner. Would you be interested in learning more about the technique? I'm starting a training program for other surgeons." The hospital board called an emergency meeting that afternoon. Marcus sat in the same seat where months ago he had faced such skepticism, but this time was different. The board unanimously voted to establish a new research center for innovative neurosurgical techniques, with Marcus as its director. That evening, as Marcus was preparing to leave, Sarah Johnson knocked on his office door. "Dr. Thompson, Emily's parents asked me to give you this." It was a card, decorated with ballet dancers. Inside was a ticket to Emily's future dance recital, scheduled for 6 months from now. Below it, Emily had written, "Thank you for helping me dance again." Marcus pinned the ticket next to his degrees and awards. As he did so, his phone buzzed with a text from his father. "Saw you on the medical news website. Your mother can't stop crying happy tears. Remember what I always told you?" Marcus smiled, remembering his father's words about letting excellence speak louder than prejudice. He texted back, "I remember, Dad. Every word." Walking through the hospital corridor, Marcus passed the wall where patient success stories were displayed. A new photo had been added. Emily doing a small ballet pose in her hospital room, her smile bright and hopeful. Below it was a quote, "Dr. Thompson didn't just save my life, he saved my dreams." As he drove home that evening, Marcus thought about how far he had come. But more importantly, he thought about how many doors this would open for others. His success wasn't just about proving his critics wrong. It was about proving that excellence knows no color, that talent deserves recognition regardless of race, and that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is simply doing what others say can't be done. The setting sun painted Boston's skyline in shades of gold, and Marcus felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, he had shown the world what he had known all along, that true power lies not in fighting prejudice, but in rising above it through undeniable excellence. 5 years had passed since Emily's groundbreaking surgery, and Boston General Hospital looked different now. The once quiet fourth floor had become a bustling center of medical innovation, with doctors from around the world coming to learn from Dr. Marcus Thompson's neurosurgical program. On this particular morning, Marcus stood in his new office, much larger than his old one, with a view of the Boston skyline. But what made him most proud wasn't the view or the size. It was the wall of photos showing all the young. "Dr. Thompson?" His assistant poked her head in. "They're ready for you in the auditorium." Marcus straightened his tie, the same lucky one his sister had given him years ago, and walked toward the hospital's main auditorium. Today was special. The inauguration of the Thompson Center for Neurosurgical Excellence, and the announcement of the first recipients of the Thompson Scholarship for minority medical students. As he entered through the back door, Marcus saw the packed auditorium. In the front row sat his parents, both older now but beaming with pride. Next to them was his sister, who had helped set up the scholarship foundation. Dr. Warner was there too, now retired but still involved with the hospital's education programs. But what caught Marcus's eye was a young woman in a ballet instructor's outfit, sitting with her parents. Emily Parker, now 17 and teaching dance to young children while preparing for college. She had danced in dozens of recitals since her surgery, and Marcus had attended every one. Dr. Sarah Chen, now the hospital's chief of surgery, stepped up to the podium. 5 years ago, she began, a young surgeon showed us that excellence knows no boundaries. Today, Dr. Marcus Thompson's surgical techniques are taught in medical schools worldwide. But his greatest contribution isn't just in the lives he's saved, It's in the doors he's opened for others. Marcus watched as Sarah Johnson, his former resident and now a successful neurosurgeon herself, walked onto the stage. She was followed by David Chen, who had gone from struggling medical student to promising young doctor. One by one, the people whose lives he had touched came forward to share their stories. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he looked out at the faces before him. My father once told me that true power lies not in proving others wrong, but in proving yourself right, he began. But I've learned something even more important. True success isn't just about personal achievement. It's about creating opportunities for others. He announced the names of the first 10 scholarship recipients, young medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds who showed promising talent. As they came forward to accept their certificates, Marcus saw in their eyes the same determination he had felt as a young doctor. After the ceremony, Marcus gave a tour of the new center to his parents. His mother stopped at the wall displaying patient success stories. There were hundreds now, including Emily's original photo. Remember when you used to practice surgery techniques on your sister's dolls? His mother asked, tears in her eyes. Look at you now, baby. His father squeezed his shoulder. You didn't just prove them wrong, son. You changed the whole game. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Marcus found himself back in his office. On his desk was a stack of letters from medical students around the country, all hoping to join his program. Next to them lay the morning's newspaper with the headline, Dr. Thompson named youngest chief of neurosurgery in hospital's history. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was one of the new scholarship recipients, a young black woman named Michelle. Dr. Thompson, I just wanted to say, seeing you succeed, knowing what you overcame, it makes me believe I can do it too. Marcus smiled, remembering how much those words would have meant to him as a young doctor. You can do it, he told her. And when you do, remember to hold the door open for someone else. As he drove home that night, Marcus thought about how far he had come from that board meeting years ago. He had transformed prejudice into progress, doubt into determination, and personal success into a legacy that would benefit generations to come. The Boston skyline glittered in the distance, and Marcus felt at peace. His true power hadn't just been in his surgical skills or his innovative techniques. It had been in his ability to rise above prejudice with dignity, to answer doubt with excellence, and to use his success to create opportunities for others. The story of Dr. Marcus Thompson wasn't just about one man proving his worth. It was about showing that when you respond to prejudice with excellence, when you meet doubt with determination, and when you use your success to lift others up, that's when real change happens. That's when you create a legacy that will outlive any prejudice.